They say you can tell what a man is really made of by watching how an animal reacts to him. By that measure, Weston Hargrove should have been the most dangerous man in the state of New York, and on paper, he was. 36 years old, head of the Hargrove family, a name that made grown men lower their voices in certain rooms from Boston to Atlantic City. But the black Frisian stallion in his training ring didn't care about any of that. It had already cost him $1.4 million. 2 broken ribs on a man he'd flown in from Kentucky, 1 severed finger on another, and the career of a trainer who used to charge $500,000 a horse. That morning, standing at the fence in a charcoal overcoat with his hands in his pockets, Weston had finally accepted that the animal couldn't be broken. And then she walked past. Holly Bennett, 27. The new nanny, his head of staff, had hired 3 weeks earlier to look after his 6-year-old daughter. She was carrying a glass of warm milk across the yard, wearing a gray sweater 2 sizes too big, and a pair of boots that had clearly seen more than one winter. She wasn't supposed to be near the ring. She wasn't supposed to stop, but she did. She stood at the fence for almost a full minute, just watching the horse, and something in the way she watched made every man in that yard go quiet without knowing why. Then she set the milk down on the post, ducked under the rail, and stepped into the ring. Nobody moved to stop her. Weston later couldn't explain why he hadn't either. Maybe it was the way she didn't look at him for permission. Maybe it was the way the stallion, mid-stride, planted all 4 hooves in the dirt the moment her boot crossed the line. Maybe it was something older than that, something he'd felt only once before in his life, the night he met the woman he would eventually bury. Whatever it was, by the time Holly Bennett raised her hand and the most dangerous animal on his property lowered its head to meet her, Weston Hargrove already knew 2 things. The woman standing in his ring wasn't who her paperwork said she was, and whatever she really was, he wasn't going to be able to let her leave. If a quiet woman with a secret worth keeping is the kind of story that pulls you in, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a slow burn done right, and subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you on time. Now, let's go back to the moment she stepped into that ring. The horse remained still beneath her palm, its breathing slowing into a steady rhythm that no one in the yard had thought it could manage that morning. Holly Bennett let her hand linger on its neck for one more beat, then another, as if she were sending a word of thanks only the animal could understand. Midnight exhaled softly, a warm breath hanging in the sharp chill of the late autumn morning. She didn't stroke it. She didn't say another word. She only drew her hand back, very slowly, the way someone pulls a fine thread from cloth without letting it snap. Once her hand had left the horse, she bent down and slipped through the fence rail with a movement so familiar that Finn O'Donnell, standing a few steps away, had to narrow his eyes. It was the movement of someone who had climbed through stable fences thousands of times in her life, not of a nanny merely passing through the yard. Holly picked up the glass of milk from the post. The surface had cooled a little, a thin skin forming over the top. She walked toward the mansion, her steps even, neither fast nor slow, as though what had just happened behind her hadn't happened at all. The men in the yard still hadn't said anything. One of them, the youngest member of the training team, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Finn took off his hat and slowly wiped his forehead, his eyes never leaving her back as she walked away. He was no longer the most expensive trainer in the region, at least not in his own eyes at that moment. Weston stood where he was for a few more seconds, then strode after her. He caught up with her at the stable gate, where the gravel path began to curve toward the main mansion. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He only stepped across her path, his shadow stretching long over the gravel. Holly stopped. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't look up right away either. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was low, nothing like an ordinary question from an employer to an employee. It was closer to the kind of question a man asks something he can't explain. She looked down at the glass of milk in her hand. She thought of her father, of what he had once taught her about how to answer a stranger, when she still didn't know who that stranger truly was. "A long time ago, sir," she replied, her voice just loud enough for him to hear, without wasting a single syllable. "Your daughter's milk is getting cold." Then she stepped past him and went straight into the mansion, without looking back even once. Weston didn't stop her. He only stood there, his hands still tucked into the pockets of his coat, watching until her shadow disappeared behind the oak door on the rear porch. Somewhere above the stable roof, a crow gave one dry, rasping cry. Gravel shifted under someone's shoes as they approached him. Tristan Hargrove stopped half a step from his brother, his hands bare and ungloved, though the morning was cold enough for their breath to show. He didn't look after Holly. He looked at Weston. "You want me to dig up her file again?" he said, not as a question, his voice as even as when he read the weekly financial reports. Deeper this time. The old ranch in Montana, the hospital in Seattle. She's ever touched in her life. Weston didn't answer at once. He was still looking at the oak door, even though it had been closed for a while. In his mind, the image of midnight lowering its head to her hand kept replaying, slower and clearer each time. He knew what he had just seen wasn't luck. He had lived long enough to know the difference between the two. Quietly, he said at last, "Don't let her know." Tristan nodded once, exactly once, then turned away. Weston remained at the stable gate a little longer. The wind carried the smell of fresh straw and another scent, the unmistakable scent of a horse that had just calmed after a panic. He suddenly realized that in the past 3 years, this was the first time someone had walked past him, and he didn't know which box in his mind to put them in. Friend, enemy, harmless, useful. She belonged in none of them, and that, he knew, was the most dangerous thing a man like him could ever encounter. The Hargrove mansion had 32 rooms, but the only room Holly truly knew her way to over the past few weeks was Mary's room on the second floor, in the east wing, with windows facing the lake. She pushed the door open gently, the warm glass of milk in her hand having lost a little of its heat on the way up from the kitchen. Mary was sitting on the edge of the bed, both legs dangling without touching the floor, her arms wrapped around a small gray teddy bear, with one ear worn thin and frayed. The little girl didn't turn when Holly stepped in. Her eyes were fixed on the window, where the morning mist still lay over the surface of the lake in a thin layer like smoke. Holly set the glass of milk on the bedside table and sat down beside the child, though not too close. Over the past 3 weeks, she had learned that with Mary, distance was something that had to be respected, the way it had to be respected with animals that had been hurt once before. "I brought a book," Holly said, her voice just soft enough. "I thought you might like this one today." She pulled a paperback picture book from under her arm, its cover showing a brown horse standing in the middle of a barley field. Mary didn't react right away. After a while, the little girl turned her head, looked at the book, then looked at Holly. Her eyes were pale blue like her mother's, something Holly had once heard Mrs. Otis Knox mention in passing in the kitchen. She opened the book and turned to the first page. She read slowly, without too much expression, without using the false voice so many adults used when reading to children. Mary moved a little closer, then a little more. By the 5th page, the child's shoulder was touching her arm. The story was about a little horse that got separated from its herd and tried to find its way home through a valley it had never crossed before. Holly had just finished reading the 7th page when Mary said, her voice so small it was almost a breath, "Does the horse have a mommy?" Holly stopped. She didn't close the book right away. She only let her hand rest still on the page. For one very brief moment, she was no longer the nanny inside a mansion in New York. She was a 7-year-old child standing in a stable in Montana, listening to her father explain why a mother horse sometimes had to let her foal go far away. "Yes," she finally answered. "The horse has a mother. Its mother is waiting for it to come home." Mary said nothing more. The little girl looked down at the teddy bear in her hands, her tiny fingers gently stroking the worn place on its ear. Holly closed the book softly and set it on the table beside the glass of milk. She didn't press for more. She didn't stretch the conversation. She only pulled the blanket up over the child, then sat down beside the bed, her back resting against the wooden headboard. Outside the window, a hawk was circling above the lake, slow and unhurried. She began to sing softly. The song wasn't an ordinary lullaby, not a tune every child in upstate New York would know. It was a Montana folk song, a song about a river running through grassland and winter stars, the one her mother used to sing when Holly was little, and before her mother, her grandmother, and before her grandmother, a woman whose name Holly had never known. Holly's voice was low, not high, not deliberately sweet. It was like a hand settling on someone's shoulder in the dark, promising nothing, only saying that someone was there. Mary closed her eyes by the 3rd line. By the 8th, her breathing had slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep. Her hand still held the teddy bear, but it was no longer gripping it tightly. Holly sang the whole song to the end, then fell silent, sitting still for a little longer to make sure the child was truly deep asleep. She didn't know how long it had been since Mary had slept like this. She only knew that over the past 3 weeks, the little girl had often woken in the middle of the night, and Holly had often had to sit beside her until morning came. Out in the hallway, less than a meter from Mary's door, Weston Hargrove stood leaning against the wall, one shoulder touching the dark blue wallpaper. He had been standing there since the second line of the song. He hadn't meant to stay. He had only been passing by on his way back to his study, heard the singing drifting through the crack in the door, and stopped. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard his daughter sleep peacefully. 3 years was long enough for a man to forget that sound. He closed his eyes, tilting his head back against the wall. One of his hands remained tucked inside his coat pocket, while the other closed into a fist, then opened again. In his mind, the image of midnight lowering its head to Holly's hand that morning, and the sound of his daughter breathing evenly in the room beside him, folded together into something he had no name for. He didn't knock. He didn't step inside. He only stood there for a little longer, then pushed himself away from the wall and went down the hallway, his footsteps lighter than usual, as though he were afraid of breaking something he himself didn't yet understand. Holly's room was at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, in the north wing, the staff quarters. It was 4 times smaller than Mary's room, but it had one large window facing the stables, something she hadn't noticed when she first took the room, and by the time she realized it, it was already too late to ask for another. That night, after she left Mary's room and made sure the little girl was deeply asleep, she returned to her own room, closed the door, but didn't turn on the light. She sat down on the wooden chair by the window, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and looked outside. Down below, the yellow lights of the stables were still glowing softly in the darkness, reflecting against the night mist in a blurred halo. She couldn't see midnight from where she sat, but she knew it was there, less than 200 meters away from her. She lifted her hand close to her face, even though she had washed her hands 3 times since morning, with the lavender-scented soap missus. Otis had left in the small bathroom of the staff wing. Even though she had scrubbed so hard that the skin around her wrist had turned red, she could still smell it. The scent of the black horse, the smell of straw, horse sweat, the leather of the bridle, the smell of something she had sworn she would never touch again. And there, in the darkness, 8 years suddenly collapsed into a single moment. She was 7 years old, standing on a wooden stool inside the stable at the Bennett Ranch in the grasslands north of Bozeman, her hand unable to reach the neck of the mare that had just given birth. Her father stood behind her, lifted her up, and placed her hand exactly where it needed to be. "Can you hear it, sweetheart?" Jesse Bennett said, his voice deep and rough like a man who had smoked for 30 years, even though he had never smoked a single cigarette. "It doesn't speak in words the way you and I do. It speaks with breath, with ears, with the trembling of its skin. You have to listen with your whole body, not just with your ears." And she had listened. For the next 12 years, she had listened to hundreds of horses, to thousands of stories they told her in the language her father had taught her. By the time she was 16, she had gentled horses that grown men had given up on. By the time she was 18, people were calling her the Whisperer at horse auctions in Kentucky and Wyoming, though she had never claimed that name for herself. She only listened. She only did what her father had taught her to do. Then came that October afternoon when she was 19. A chestnut stallion, the one her father had been working with for 3 months, the one both father and daughter had believed had already made it past the hardest part. She stood at the stable door, holding a bucket of water, watching her father step inside. Everything was normal. The sunlight slanted through the gaps in the wooden boards at the same angle it did every other afternoon. The horse stood still, its ears turned toward her father, exactly the way a horse that had learned to trust humans should stand. She remembered smiling. She remembered that very clearly. Then the horse suddenly reared. No signal, no warning, no sign that she or her father could read, though both of them had spent their whole lives reading horses. 20 seconds. That was all the time between the moment the animal changed and the moment she dropped the bucket and ran inside. But 20 seconds was too much. 32 years of Jesse Bennett's work with horses ended in those 20 seconds, on the concrete floor of a stable he had built with his own hands. The veterinarian who came the next day couldn't explain it. The 2 seasoned trainers from Montana who came the following week couldn't either. No one could understand why that horse had done what it did, but she understood one thing. She had been standing at the door. She had been watching. And she hadn't read anything. The horse had said something to her that afternoon, and she hadn't heard it. After her father's funeral, she sold the ranch within 6 weeks, paid off the tax debt, and took her mother to Seattle. Her mother had already had a tumor in her lung before her father died, but she had hidden it. She hadn't wanted to trouble Jesse. The next 6 years became a long chain of hospitals, chemotherapy sessions, cramped rented apartments in East Seattle, and nights when Holly slept in an armchair beside a hospital bed, her hand still holding her mother's. Her mother died on a spring morning 2 years ago, while a sparrow was singing outside the window. The remaining medical debt was $180,000. Holly had stood before her mother's coffin and sworn 2 things. 1, she would pay off that debt, no matter how many years it took. 2, she would continue to honor the silent vow she had carried since her father's funeral, never to touch another horse again for as long as she lived. She had kept her distance from horses for 8 years, and for the last 2, she had strictly held to both of her heavy promises. Until this morning, Holly lowered her hand into her lap. She looked at her fingers in the darkness. They still carried midnight scent. Down below, the stable lights suddenly went out. Someone had locked the barn for the night. She sat there for a very long time, not crying, not sleeping, only looking out the window, until the first winter stars began to appear above the pine forest. 3 days after the morning in the training yard, the weather had grown noticeably colder. The maple leaves along the row of trees lining the estate drive had all turned the color of burnished brass, and the wind had begun carrying the damp chill that belonged to the end of the year in upstate New York. Weston sat in the study on the 2nd floor of the main mansion, in the west wing, a room paneled in dark walnut with 2 large windows overlooking the garden that had already shed almost all of its leaves. He had finished 2 calls with Manhattan and 1 call with Boston before 9 o'clock in the morning. Now in front of him sat a cup of black coffee, already half cold, and a stack of reports he had skimmed but hadn't truly absorbed. Tristan knocked twice before pushing the door open and stepping inside. He wasn't carrying a laptop like he had the previous times. In his hand was only a thin gray folder, the kind the Hargrove family used for things that weren't saved on a computer. He set it on his brother's desk, didn't sit down, and only stood beside the chair. "I've got everything that can be obtained without setting off alarms," he said, his voice as even as always. "Read from the bottom up. The official paperwork is at the front. The unofficial part is at the back." Weston didn't answer. He pulled the folder toward himself and opened it. 14 pages. He began reading from the top down, not as his brother had instructed. He wanted to see the picture in the exact order the world had presented it about her. Page 1. Birth certificate. Holly Margaret Bennett, born in Gallatin County, Montana, on March 11th, 1998. Father, Jesse Bennett, horse trainer, self-employed. Mother, Rose Bennett, elementary school teacher. Pages 2 through 4. School records. Recommendation letters from Bozeman High School. Provisional admission letter to Montana State University, majoring in animal science, in 2016. Page 5. Application to defer her studies. Submitted in the middle of the first semester of 2018. The reason given was family matters. Page 6. Jesse Bennett's death certificate. Cause of death, head trauma, occupational accident. He slowed for 1 beat as he read that line, then continued. Pages 7 through 10. Rose Bennett's medical records. Stage 3 lung cancer, progressing to stage 4 after 2 years. Treatment records from 3 different hospitals in Seattle over 6 years. The final bill of $180,000. Date of death, April of 2024. Page 11. Holly's employment history from 2019 to the present. Waitress, cashier, hourly house cleaner, seasonal nanny through 2 agencies in Seattle, then transferred to a high-end agency in Manhattan 8 months ago. No criminal record. No debt except the medical bills she was paying off in installments. No contact with any relatives except a distant aunt in Idaho whom she called only every Christmas. Weston had read this far with the feeling that the picture was almost clear. A woman who had suffered, who had lost everything, who was trying to pay a debt that wasn't her fault. That explained her silence. That explained the boots that had survived too many winters. It didn't explain the horse. He turned to page 12. The unofficial section. The last 2 pages were printed on different paper, the font smaller, with no heading. Tristan had bought them from someone outside the system. He began reading, and by the 4th line he had gone still. Jesse Bennett had one only daughter. In the horse training circles of the western states, from 2013 to 2018. She was known not by her full name, but by a nickname, the Whisperer. At 15, she was invited to join the training team of a racing stable in Kentucky. At 17, she turned down a contract worth $600,000 a year from the Callaway Ranch in Texas. At 18, she was mentioned in 2 trade articles in Western Horseman magazine. In October of 2018, after her father's death, she vanished from the world completely. No one in the business had heard a word about her in nearly 8 years. Weston read the last line, then read the whole passage again from the beginning. He didn't blink throughout the second reading. Then he folded the folder shut and rested his hand on its cover for a while, the way a person rests a hand on a door before deciding whether to open it. Tristan remained still beside the chair, saying nothing, waiting. "No one touches her," Weston finally said, his voice low but clear. "No more surveillance, no more questions. No one in this house tells her I know anything about that name." Tristan nodded once. "And Finn?" Weston didn't answer right away. He took his phone from the pocket of his vest, found the number, and pressed call. Finn O'Donnell answered after 2 rings, his voice still thick with sleep even though it was almost 10 o'clock in the morning. Weston didn't say hello. "Finn," he said, "I won't need you anymore. Security will escort you to the gate at noon. The severance check was deposited into your account last night." The other end of the line went silent for one long beat, and then Finn understood. He was a man who had lived long enough in the horse world to know when not to ask another question. "Good luck with that horse, Mr. Hargrove," Finn said, his voice carrying no resentment, only something close to acceptance. And with the person who gentled it, Weston ended the call. He set the phone down on the desk, placed the folder in the lower right drawer, the one he locked with his own private key. When he looked up, Tristan was still standing there, and for the first time in a very long while, he saw his brother looking at him with an expression Tristan had never worn before. An expression that said he had recognized something about his older brother that even Weston himself hadn't yet dared to name. The storm arrived close to midnight, nearly 2 hours earlier than the weather forecast had predicted. The wind struck the lake into waves of white, and the rain began to fall not in drops, but in sheets, lashing sideways across the estate as if someone were swinging a whip. At 12:15, a bolt of lightning hit the old oak tree near the main gate, and the explosion shook the third-floor window frames. Holly woke at once. She didn't wake because of the thunder. She woke because of another sound, a sound her ears had been trained since she was 7 years old to recognize even from the deepest sleep. The sound of a horse slamming its head against wooden boards. She sat up in bed, her feet touching the cold floor. Down below, across the gravel yard, the stable lights were flickering wildly, and shadows of people were running back and forth in the yellow glow. She recognized the head, stable hand shouting something, his voice shredded by the rain. Then came another impact, harder than the one before, followed by the sound of wood cracking. She pulled on jeans, dragged a sweater over her head, and didn't bother brushing her hair. She ran down the hallway, down the stairs, stopping outside Mary's room only long enough to glance in. The little girl was still asleep, clutching her teddy bear, not waking even though lightning had struck. Holly knocked on butler Otis Knox's door on the ground floor. 2 clean taps. He opened it after 3 seconds, still wearing plaid flannel pajamas, his silver hair mussed. Holly didn't give a long explanation. "Mr. Otis, Mary is asleep. She may wake up because of the thunder. Would you sit in the hallway outside her room for me?" Otis looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, then nodded. 50 years of working for the Hargrove family had taught him when a request wasn't really a request. He took his coat and draped it over himself, then headed toward the stairs. Holly ran out to the rear porch, threw on the raincoat hanging from the hook, and pulled the hood over her head. From the rear porch to the isolation stable was 50 steps across gravel. But in the storm, it felt 3 times longer. The rain hammered against her raincoat like someone clapping without stopping. When she reached the stable door, she saw 6 people standing outside beneath the overhang. The remaining members of the training team were among them, looking on in helpless silence alongside 2 estate guards. No one went in. The door to the isolation stable was open. Inside, Midnight stood in the farthest corner, head lowered, its 2 front legs bending and straightening over and over as if it didn't know where to put its weight. White foam frothed at its mouth. 2 wooden boards at the back of the stall had cracked, one nearly split through. Every time lightning struck, it lunged forward several steps and slammed its head into the boards. Holly pushed one of the trainers aside without saying anything. He didn't stop her. "Don't," one of the trainers said, his voice trembling. "If that animal hits you once, you're dead." She didn't answer. She stepped into the stable, pulled the door closed behind her but didn't shut it completely, leaving only a narrow gap. She didn't move toward midnight. She took off her raincoat, folded it neatly, and set it on a wooden chair in the near corner. Then she sat down in the straw, her back against the wall opposite the horse, her knees drawn up. Midnight looked at her. It was still breathing hard, still foaming, but it had stopped hitting its head. She didn't look straight into its eyes. She looked down at her hands, resting on her knees, in the same posture her father had once used inside a stable when she was 7, the first time he taught her how to sit with a frightened animal. He had said, "You don't go toward it. You let it know you're not the storm. You're the floor." The first minute passed, then the second. Lightning still struck outside, but less often now. Midnight shifted its weight from one leg to another. By the 7th minute, it released one long breath, and the ears that had been pinned flat back lifted slightly. She still didn't look at it. By the 10th minute, she began speaking softly. Not to the horse exactly, but almost to herself, about something she hadn't said aloud in 8 years. She spoke about the sound of rain on the storage barn roof at the old ranch. She spoke about a mare named Maple that her father had sold when she was 12. Her voice was even, neither rising nor falling, like someone reading an old letter to a friend she hadn't seen in a long time. By the 16th minute, Midnight took one step toward her, then another. By the 19th minute, it stood 3 steps away from her, its head lower than ever. Its eyes were still wet, but no longer rolled white. She didn't raise her hand. She only tilted her head back against the wooden boards and closed her eyes. By the 20th minute, Midnight lowered its head, and she felt its warm breath on her shoulder. Then the whole weight of its head. That horse, weighing 600 kilograms, had placed its forehead on her shoulder and stood still there, its breathing slowing to match hers. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't move. She only let one hand rest on its muzzle, not stroking, only resting there. Outside, the men of the training team had long since fallen silent. No one dared move, afraid of breaking what was happening, and that was when Holly felt someone standing at the stable door behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Weston Hargrove stood in the narrow opening, his black vest soaked from shoulder to hem, his hair stuck to his forehead, water running in streams from his chin down into the collar of his white shirt. He must have run from the main mansion when he heard the alarm, and he had been standing there for who knew how long. He didn't step inside. He didn't say a single word. He only stood there, in the storm, watching the woman who had sworn 8 years ago never to touch another horse again, let the most dangerous animal on his estate rest its head on her shoulder. And for the first time since the night he had to bury his wife, he felt something inside his chest, something he had no name for, and he wasn't sure whether he wanted a name for it or not. The storm cleared close to 3 o'clock in the morning, leaving the estate in a silence deeper than ordinary silence, the kind of silence that belonged to earth and wood soaked all the way through. By 5:30, the eastern sky held a thin pewter line along the horizon, promising a day heavy with clouds but no rain. Holly came down to the kitchen at 5:40. She hadn't been able to sleep after returning from the stable. She had changed into dry clothes, had sat by the window looking out at the garden until the sky began to lighten a little, and now she needed a cup of coffee before Mary woke. The kitchen of the Hargrove mansion was wide, lined in pale gray marble, with 2 doors opening to the rear garden and a long oak table set in the middle, the kind of table where the staff ate breakfast in the early hours before the family rose. At that hour, the kitchen was still empty. Mrs. Otis hadn't come down yet. The head chef wouldn't start until 6 o'clock. Holly took her own coffee filter from a cabinet above the sink, set the kettle on the induction stove, and leaned against the stone counter, waiting for the water to boil. She heard the rear porch door give a soft creak, then the sound of leather shoes crossing the wooden floor. She didn't need to turn around. Weston stepped into the kitchen, closed the porch door behind him, and didn't turn on any more lights. He had changed clothes, wearing a gray-blue shirt with the sleeves folded to his elbows, his hair still slightly damp, like a man who had just showered without rushing. He stopped 3 steps away from her, no closer. He looked at the kettle, beginning to murmur softly. "You didn't sleep," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Neither did you," she replied, still looking at the kettle. He gave a nod she didn't see, then said plainly what he had come to the kitchen at that hour to say. "I want you to train it, officially." His voice was nothing like that of an employer offering a job. It sounded like a man placing something on the table after thinking about it all night. Not just stepping in now and then when something happens. Every day, from morning to afternoon, arranged around Mary's schedule however you choose. A separate contract with me, outside the agency, 5 times what they're paying you. The kettle sang louder for one beat, then went quiet when she pressed the button. Holly took the coffee filter, added the grounds, poured the water, and didn't hurry. She made each movement the way she did every other morning, as though he had just said something to her about the weather. Then she set the kettle down, turned back, leaned one hip against the stone counter, and folded her arms across her chest. For the first time since he had entered the kitchen, she looked directly at his face. In the dimness of the early morning, her eyes looked nothing like the eyes of a nanny being offered 5 times her salary. They were the eyes of someone who had calculated very quickly in her mind and had already decided. "I'll work with the horse," she said. Her voice was steady, not raised, but not hiding what she thought either. "But I won't take extra money for it. My agency salary stays the same. Mary's nanny work remains my first priority. The horse only gets the hours it needs, when I'm free." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her as if he were looking at an equation whose variables he had assumed wrong. "Why?" he asked. She thought for one beat, then answered, "I'll do it for the horse, not for you." The sentence wasn't cruel. It was only direct. It was spoken the way one states a simple truth, not to wound, but because she no longer had the strength to lie at that hour of the morning. Weston didn't blink. In the 3 years since he had inherited the family, no one had sat across from him and refused his money without paying a price. No one had refused him like that. In a way he couldn't answer with power, because there was nothing to answer. She wasn't asking for anything. She was only setting the boundary of herself. He stood there for one more beat, then he gave one nod. Only one. "Fine," he said. He turned away. He took fewer than 5 steps toward the rear porch door. At the threshold, with his hand on the doorknob, he stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, only his head, just enough for his voice to come through clearly. "You still haven't told me the truth." Holly didn't turn her face toward him. She was pouring coffee from the filter into her cup, her hand steady. "You still haven't asked the right question." He stood there for one more second, then he opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him without a sound. Holly set the coffee filter down. Her hand was still steady, but she realized she had been holding her breath through that last sentence. She exhaled, slowly, and lifted the cup of coffee to her lips. Outside the window, the pewter line of the horizon had turned to copper. In the days after the storm, the estate settled into a new rhythm that no one named aloud. Holly kept exactly what she had told Weston in the kitchen that morning. In the mornings, she was still Mary's nanny, reading books, preparing a light breakfast, taking the little girl to the private classroom where the tutor from Manhattan came 3 times a week. But from the midday break until late afternoon, she was at the stables. She didn't use a bridle. She didn't use a whip. She walked into the training yard with a cloth bag of sliced apples and a low wooden chair, and most of the time, she only sat there. Finn's old training team left after a week. The 2 young stable hands were kept on, and they learned how to stand farther away when she was working. By the middle of the 2nd week, Midnight let her brush its mane. By the end of the 3rd week, it had allowed her to place a saddle on its back, though she hadn't ridden it yet. She told it she wasn't ready, and that turned out to be true for both of them. One afternoon at the beginning of the 4th week, Holly led a golden-brown pony named Biscuit into the small yard beside Midnight's stable. Mary stood by the fence, her hands gripping the wooden rail tightly, her eyes wide. The little girl had never ridden a horse, even though the estate had stables. Holly had asked Weston the week before, and he had only nodded once, saying nothing. She lifted Mary onto the saddle, placed the child's tiny hands on the pony's mane, and walked the pony around the yard by the lead rope. Biscuit was the gentlest horse in the stable, 14 years old, and had taught countless children at a therapy center before Weston bought it. Mary sat stiffly for the first minute, then she realized the pony wasn't doing anything. It was only walking. It was breathing. It was softly tossing its head. Mary burst out laughing, the laughter of a 6-year-old child, unrestrained, unguarded, a full, round sound she hadn't made in this house since her mother died. On the 2nd floor porch, About 30 meters from the small yard, Weston stood behind one of the tall windows. He had meant to go down to the library to get a file, but he heard the laughter from outside, and he had stopped at the window. He didn't step out onto the porch. He only stood there, one hand resting against the window frame, and the 3 years of silence in this house collapsed inside his chest into something he didn't dare name. He watched until Holly lifted his daughter down from the saddle. That Friday, Weston invited Holly to dinner. He didn't call it dinner. He only said through Mrs. Otis that he would be eating in the small dining room at 8 o'clock and that he wanted her present. Holly had exactly one dress in her wardrobe, a long-sleeved black cotton dress with a small V neckline, one she had bought at a thrift store in Seattle 5 years earlier to attend her mother's funeral. She wore it, tied her hair back, and came downstairs exactly at 8 o'clock. He wore a gray shirt without a tie, sitting at the head of the table, and when she walked in, he stood, which she hadn't expected. They spent most of the meal in a comfortable silence, speaking of small things about Mary, about how the little girl had asked for the first time when she could ride Biscuit again. He didn't ask her about Montana. She didn't ask him about Hargrove Capital. At the end of the meal, after Mrs. Otis had cleared the table, he invited her into the reading room, and she followed. The reading room was smaller than his study, paneled in dark wood, with a fire burning in the hearth, and 2 armchairs set across from each other with a low wooden table between them. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, asked if she wanted one, and she shook her head. She sat down in the armchair across from him. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. "My wife," he said, after a very long while. His voice was steady, as though he had practiced this sentence many times in his mind before saying it aloud. "She died in a car explosion. The car was supposed to be mine. That afternoon, I changed my schedule and let her go in my place. I haven't told anyone that in 3 years." Holly looked at the fire, not at him. She was silent for a while. She knew he didn't need her comfort. She knew that because she had never needed anyone's comfort for the same kind of thing either. "I was 19, she finally said, her voice small. "I was standing at the stable door. That horse said something in the 3 seconds before it reared, and I didn't read it. My father had taught me to read them since I was 7, and I didn't read it." He didn't answer right away. He set the glass of whiskey down on the table without having taken a single sip. "You had 3 seconds to save him," he said. "I had 6 hours to tell her to take another car." Neither of them said anything more for a long time. Outside the window, the night wind stirred an oak branch against the glass. They sat at opposite ends of a distance that did not close. But that night, in that small room paneled in dark wood, something shifted between them, something they both felt and neither of them named. They didn't touch each other. When she stood to return to her room, he didn't ask her to stay. But for the first time in many years, he didn't finish the whiskey he had poured. Audrey Prescott arrived at the estate on a Tuesday afternoon, driving the ivory-white Mercedes convertible she had bought 2 years earlier, with an end-of-year bonus from Hargrove Capital. She hadn't given notice. She didn't need to. In 5 years as Weston's personal lawyer, and in 2 of those years as something else as well, she had never needed to announce herself before coming. She wore a camel-colored belted coat, high heels with red soles, and her blonde hair was cut to her shoulders in the newest style favored by women lawyers on Madison Avenue. She climbed the front steps with a folder case in her hand, telling the gate guard she had come to discuss a divestiture in Delaware. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Weston met her in his study at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They worked through the documents for 40 minutes, efficient and professional, like 2 people already accustomed to each other's rhythm. Audrey signed 2 pages, pushed them across the desk, then leaned back in her chair and studied him. She was about to say something she had prepared throughout the 2-hour drive from Manhattan, but before she could open her mouth, something cut across her intention. Outside the study window, in the direction of the gravel yard, Holly was walking back from the stables toward the main mansion. She wore a blue plaid flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair tied loosely, her steps even. Weston, seated across from Audrey, holding a pen to sign the 3rd page, lifted his eyes when Holly's shadow passed the window. It wasn't a long look, only 1 beat. Then he lowered his gaze and signed his name. But Audrey had seen that beat, and Audrey had once been the woman Weston looked at in a different way, before Clara Hargrove died, before Weston closed every door inside himself for the past 3 years. She knew that look. She said nothing more in the study. She thanked him, gathered the documents, and stood. In the hallway, she told him she wanted a cup of tea before driving back. He nodded and called Mrs. Otis to prepare the small sitting room on the ground floor. She had been waiting alone in the sitting room for 10 minutes when Holly passed the doorway on her way from the kitchen to Mary's room. Audrey stood at the threshold, her voice sweet. "You're the new nanny, aren't you?" Holly stopped. She gave one polite nod. "Yes. Do you need anything, ma'am?" Audrey smiled. The kind of smile 10 years in Manhattan boardrooms had sharpened like a razor. "Nothing at all. I only wanted to introduce myself. I'm Audrey, the Hargrove family's lawyer. I've worked with Weston for a long time. Long enough that I almost know every kind of woman he becomes interested in, and every kind he leaves behind." She paused for one beat, her eyes drifting down to Holly's worn boots, then rising again. "You seem to belong to the second kind. Don't misunderstand me. I mean that kindly." Holly didn't blink. She stood still at the threshold, the cup of tea in her hand not yet touched to her lips. "Thank you for your concern," she replied, her voice even, neither rising nor falling. "With your permission, Mary is waiting for her afternoon milk. I wish you a safe drive back to the city." She inclined her head once, then turned away. Audrey stood there watching until Holly's shadow disappeared beyond the stairs. Her smile had vanished before Holly had taken 3 steps away. Audrey didn't stay to finish her tea. She told Mrs. Otis that she had just remembered a call that required her to return to the city immediately. On her way out to the car, she stopped in the side corridor leading down to the basement, where the security control room was located. In 5 years as the family's personal lawyer, she had access codes for legitimate work purposes. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. 20 minutes later, she came out with her folder case in hand, and no one noticed, because the security staff on duty had grown used to seeing her in places like that over the years. She had entered a line of code into the control system for the mansion's safe room door, a small back door so slight that only someone who knew about it would ever find it. She drove out through the estate gate at 7 o'clock in the evening, when the sky had already gone completely dark. On Highway 32, about 10 miles from the gate, she pulled into a gas station, took a cheap second phone from the glove compartment, and dialed a number she had memorized. The other end picked up after 3 rings. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I think it's time we talked." 9 days after Audrey's visit, on her way back from the private staff mailboxes near the inner gate, Holly noticed an envelope tucked between 2 of her credit card bills. It was white, with no stamp, no postmark, no sender's name. Only her name was handwritten in black ink, the letters round and even, like someone had deliberately written slowly so no one would recognize the hand. She stood in the side hallway, in the pale yellow light of late afternoon, and opened the envelope right there. Inside was only one folded sheet of paper. 2 sentences. "If you're still there by next week, someone dies." Could be the little one. She read it the first time, then a second time. She didn't feel her legs go numb right away. That came later, after she had reached her room and locked the door behind her. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the paper still on her knees, and read it a 3rd time. The 4 words could be "the little one" were no larger than the others, but they had taken over her entire field of vision. She thought of Mary sitting in the private classroom downstairs. She thought of the round, full sound of the little girl's laughter on Biscuit's back 3 weeks earlier. She thought of the child's question about whether the horse had a mother. She didn't think of Weston at any point during those 10 minutes. She thought of the 6-year-old child sitting downstairs, knowing nothing, coloring a page about the solar system. She stood up. She didn't go toward Weston's study. She didn't go looking for Tristan. She knew that if she told him, he would make her stay. And if he made her stay, the threat in the letter would follow the exact direction it had written. She had lost her father because of 3 seconds she hadn't been able to read. She wasn't going to lose anyone else because of a decision she could avoid. She opened the wardrobe. She pulled her cloth travel bag from the bottom of the closet, the same bag she had carried from Seattle to Manhattan 8 months earlier. She began folding clothes: 2 sweaters, 3 shirts, 1 black dress, a few pairs of socks, her second pair of boots. She didn't have much. Packing took less than 15 minutes. When she folded the last flannel shirt, her tears fell onto the sleeve before she even knew she was crying. She made no sound. She had learned how to cry silently during 6 years of sitting in her mother's hospital rooms. She kept folding, then sat down on the floor, her back against the edge of the bed, the travel bag at her feet, and let the tears fall without covering her face. Her bedroom door opened a crack. She hadn't heard a knock, because there hadn't been one. Mary stood at the threshold, holding a paper crane in one hand, the other hand resting on the doorframe. The little girl had been passing through the hallway on her way back from the bathroom to her room, and she had stopped when she heard something inside. A sound a 6-year-old child knew how to recognize, because she had once heard her mother make it during the final 3 years. Holly looked up. She didn't have time to wipe her face. Mary wasn't afraid. The little girl stepped into the room and closed the door behind her carefully with both hands. She walked over to Holly, unhurried, and sat down on the floor across from her. At the distance a child had learned was the right distance when an adult was sad. She didn't hug Holly right away. She placed the paper crane on the floor between them. The crane was folded from pale blue paper, its creases uneven, one wing curling upward slightly. Holly recognized it as a page from the coloring notebook she had bought for Mary the week before at the little bookstore in town. "Please don't go," Mary said. Her voice was small, but clear. It didn't tremble. "Daddy needs you. I need you too." Holly opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She reached out, and Mary shifted over to wrap her arms around Holly's neck. Holly held the child back, tightly, her hand resting against the little girl's small back, her cheek pressed to the child's hair. Mary smelled of children's soap and a little of afternoon milk. Holly held her like that for a very long while, saying nothing. Then she eased the child back to arm's length and wiped her own face with her sleeve. She reached for the letter lying on the bedside table. She tore it in half in front of Mary, then into 4 pieces, then into 8. The little girl watched her and didn't ask what it was. Holly gathered the torn scraps into her palm and closed her hand tightly around them. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady again. "I'm here." Mary nodded once, then handed her the paper crane. "It's for you," the little girl said. That night, Holly slept beside Mary's bed, the armchair pulled close to the mattress, until morning came. The travel bag was still in the middle of her room, but she didn't go back to finish closing it. She had decided. She would stay, but she wouldn't tell anyone, and she would be the one standing between whatever was coming and that little girl. What Holly didn't know, and what Audrey had misjudged, was that the private staff mailboxes at the inner gate were not only visited by the mailman. 3 weeks earlier, right after Audrey's visit, Tristan had quietly installed a small camera above the mailboxes, hidden inside the wooden seam of the shelter roof. Not because he suspected Holly, because he had suspected Audrey from the very moment she asked permission to stay for a cup of tea she never drank. 40 minutes before Holly went out to collect the mail that afternoon, Tristan had reviewed the footage from 11 o'clock the previous night. An old pickup truck stopped at the side entrance. A man in a dark blue jacket, wearing gloves, stepped out, slipped an envelope into Holly's mailbox in less than 4 seconds, then left. The last 2 characters of the license plate had been covered with black tape, but the first 3 were enough for Tristan to trace it. The truck was registered under the name of a shell company in Yonkers, and that shell company had once appeared in an internal report he had read 2 years earlier, in a list of paper layers wrapped around Brannon Whitfield's empire. Tristan had photographed the letter after Holly left the mailboxes and went back to her room, using a long-range lens from a second-floor window. He didn't enter her room. He gave her time with what she had just read, but he stepped into his brother's study immediately afterward. Weston read the photograph of the letter in silence. He read it the first time, then the second. Tristan didn't need to report more. He had already cross-checked the footage against the access log for the security control room over the past 2 months. Only one name outside the family had entered that room during the week Audrey came, and had entered at an hour that didn't fit any legal work. Weston set the printout face down on the desk. He said nothing for 1 full minute. When he spoke, his voice was no louder than usual, but there was something in it Tristan hadn't heard in 3 years. "Bring the courier here," he said. "No one touches her or the little girl in the meantime. Don't let her know anything." Tristan nodded and turned away. The courier was found in a cheap motel in Poughkeepsie, close to 10 o'clock that night. He didn't resist. He was brought to the old warehouse at the farthest corner of the estate, nearly 1 mile from the main mansion, a warehouse used only for storing farm machinery and not connected to the main camera system. Weston arrived there close to midnight, wearing a long black coat, walking alone from the parking area. Inside the warehouse, Tristan and 2 of the estate's men were already waiting. The lights in the warehouse were off, with only 1 yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, shining down onto the middle of the concrete floor. The courier sat on a wooden chair in the center of the light, not tied up, because there was no need. What happened over the next 40 minutes inside that warehouse wasn't recorded by anyone, and it didn't need to be. From outside, all that could be heard was a man's very even voice, asking the same 3 questions again and again, followed by a long silence, then the sound of wood striking concrete, then silence. Then that same even voice asking again. Weston's shadow was cast against the rear wall of the warehouse, standing straight, unhurried. The courier left the warehouse close to 1 o'clock in the morning, able to walk, still remembering his own name, and having said everything he knew, including the name of the person who had paid him and the phone number he had used for contact. Weston returned to the main mansion at 1:10. He didn't go change his clothes. He went straight to the reading room, sat down in the same armchair where he had sat with Holly 2 weeks earlier, and called Audrey. She was in Manhattan, in her apartment on Madison Avenue. She answered after the 5th ring, her voice sleepy and wary at the same time. "Audrey," he said. He didn't greet her. "Get in your car. Drive here now." She arrived at the estate at 3:15 in the morning. There was already mist on Highway 32, and she had cried throughout the 2.5-hour drive without knowing for certain what she would have to hear when she arrived. When she stepped into the reading room, Weston was sitting in the armchair, with no whiskey, no documents on the table, only a phone whose screen had gone dark. He didn't invite her to sit. She stood in the middle of the room, clutching her folder case, her makeup running in 2 gray streaks beneath her eyes. "Weston, I don't know what you've heard, but," she began. He cut her off with one sentence. 3 hours to leave the state. His voice was no louder than a whisper. 3 hours. By 6 o'clock in the morning, if you're still in New York State, I won't be able to control what happens to you anymore. You know exactly what that means." Audrey collapsed to her knees. She cried. She said she had been stupid, that she hadn't thought Brannon would go that far, that she still loved him. He had heard the 3rd sentence when he stood up. He walked past her, without touching her, without looking at her, and left the reading room. He didn't turn back. She left the estate at 4:10, her car driving through the gate without headlights for the first 200 meters. Weston stood at the 2nd-floor window, watching the lights of her car disappear into the distance. Then he walked down the hallway, up the north wing staircase, to Holly's room. He knocked twice. She opened the door after 10 seconds. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair tied loosely, dark shadows under her eyes. Behind her, on the floor of the room, he saw the cloth travel bag already packed. He looked at the bag. Then he looked at her. "You were going to leave," he said. His voice wasn't angry. There was only something close to exhaustion, and something else she had never heard in his voice before. "You should have come to me first." Holly stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the edge of the door, and for the first time since that morning in the training yard many weeks earlier, she had no answer to give. The following week passed in a kind of quiet that anyone who had lived in Weston's world long enough would recognize as the wrong kind of quiet. There were no calls from Brannon, no move from Audrey, no information flowing back from Tristan's network except a few insignificant scraps. Weston didn't let that make him loosen his grip. He had doubled the guards at the inner gate and the outer gate, called in 4 more men from Boston, and stationed a backup team at the nearest hotel, 12 miles from the estate. He thought he had covered every angle. He thought wrong. On Saturday afternoon, at 4 o'clock, he received a call from a partner in Boston, a man who had worked with the Hargrove family for 10 years, a man Weston had no reason to suspect. There was an urgent issue involving a shipment that had been loaded onto a vessel at Charlestown Harbor, a problem only he could solve, and it had to be tonight. He hesitated for 20 minutes. He called Tristan and asked for his opinion. Tristan said he would stay at the estate and reinforce the staff. Weston went into Mary's room at 7 o'clock that evening. The little girl was drawing a picture of the sun. He kissed the top of her head and told her Daddy would be back before lunch tomorrow. He passed Holly in the 2nd-floor hallway at 7:20, on his way down to the car. He stopped for 1 beat, intending to say something, but in the end he only nodded. She nodded too. The car left the gate at 7:35. 3 hours later, when his car had passed Hartford and was traveling east on Highway 90, Tristan received a message from the Boston partner saying the meeting had been canceled because the other side hadn't shown up. Tristan called Weston immediately. After hearing it, Weston said nothing for 3 seconds, then turned the car around at the next exit. He called Tristan again on the way back. "Get Mary and Holly into the safe room right now. Don't wait. Don't explain. I'm on my way. Tristan was on the ground floor when he received the call. He ran up to the second floor, knocked on Mary's door, then Holly's. He told Holly in the calmest voice he could manage that there was a small security issue, that she and Mary needed to go down to the safe room in the basement for a while. Holly looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, then picked Mary up. The little girl was drowsy, holding her teddy bear, asking nothing. The safe room was in the east wing basement, behind a false oak door that looked like the door to a wine room. Behind the wooden door was a thick steel door with a keypad and fingerprint scanner. Tristan went first. Holly followed with Mary in her arms, and the basement hallway smelled of cedarwood and the cold breath of stone. Tristan entered the code. The red light flashed 3 times. He entered it again. The red light flashed 3 more times. He tried his fingerprint. The scanner gave 1 beep, then went completely dead. At that same moment, from above, at the outer gate, the first gunshot rang out. Tristan swore under his breath, very softly, so Mary wouldn't hear. He drew the handgun from the holster at his back and turned to Holly. The system's been compromised. I have to go up to the yard. Get her somewhere hidden, anywhere you can think of, and don't let her see anything. Holly nodded once. He handed her a small key, side gate to the stable. It only opens from the inside with this key. Then he ran up the stairs. Holly stood for 1 second in the basement hallway, Mary in her arms. The little girl was fully awake now, her eyes wide open, but she hadn't cried. "Miss Holly," she whispered. "Where are we going?" Holly leaned close to her ear, her voice steady. "We're playing hide and seek. Remember, I told you about this game. We're going to hide somewhere very secret, and you have to stay very quiet until I or Daddy comes to find you. Can you do that?" Mary nodded, solemn as an adult. "I can." Holly lifted her higher and went back out through the basement rear porch door, the door leading to the service path that ran across the side yard toward the stable. Outside, the night was pitch black, with only the scattered sound of gunfire at the outer gate and men shouting something to one another. She didn't run right away. She stood behind the door, cracked slightly open, counted to 5, listened for the direction of the noise, then held Mary tight against her chest, tucked the child's head into her shoulder, and ran. 50 steps across gravel. She counted every step. She didn't look back toward the mansion. At the stable's side door, she inserted the key, opened it, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. The stable was quiet, except for the breathing of the 5 horses inside. Midnight was in the last stall on the right, its ears lifting straight up when it heard her come in. She didn't go toward it. She went straight to the dry feed room at the end of the stable, a thick wooden door behind which were sacks of oats, sacks of bran, and sacks of dried carrots. She pushed 2 oat sacks aside, making a space just large enough for a 6-year-old child to sit curled up. She set Mary down there. "Listen to me," she said, holding the child's shoulders with both hands, her voice even and clear. "You sit here. You hold your bear. You count to 100 very slowly in your head, then start over from the beginning, until I or Daddy opens the door. You don't open the door for anyone else. You don't make a sound. No matter what you hear out there, promise me." Mary looked at her, and the little girl recognized something in Holly's eyes that made her ask no more questions. She nodded once. "I promise." Holly kissed her forehead very quickly, then stood, stepped out of the feed room, closed the door, and latched it from the outside with the wooden bolt. She heard Mary begin counting in a whisper inside. 1, 2, 3. She took 1 step back, turned, and was about to move toward the side door to block the entrance. At that exact moment, the side door she had just come through was shoved open from outside. A man stepped in, a gun in his hand, a black coat on his body, his face covered by a dark scarf. He looked around the stable for 1 second, then his gaze stopped on her. Holly stood in the middle of the stable, her back turned toward the dry feed room where Mary was whispering her numbers inside. She didn't look that way. She looked straight at the man. Then she slowly stepped in the opposite direction, toward the far end of the stable, toward the last stall on the right, where Midnight stood with its ears raised straight up. The man said nothing. He didn't need to. He aimed the gun fitted with a suppressor at her, and began walking slowly into the stable, the soles of his shoes pressing into the straw without making a sound. Holly backed away, 1 step at a time, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't run, because running would draw him toward the dry feed room. She needed him to follow her. She needed to pull him away from the whispered counting of the 6-year-old child sitting among the oat sacks at the other end of the stable. She backed all the way to the last stall on the right. Her back touched Midnight's stall door. She heard the horse breathing right behind the nape of her neck, its warmth spilling down over her shoulder. It was standing close against the stall door, looking over her shoulder at the man. Its ears were pinned flat back. The man stopped 4 steps away from her. He raised the gun a little higher. Holly knew she had no more time to think. She had only one thing he didn't have. She tilted her head slightly backward and whispered, her voice so low only the horse behind her could hear it. "I'm sorry. I need you." Then she let go of the stall frame and reached behind her, toward the iron latch holding the stall door closed. She pushed the latch up. She pushed the stall door open. Then she threw herself to the left, pressing her body against the wooden wall of the next stall. Midnight burst out of the stall in a single beat, too fast for an ordinary person to see in time. Its 600 kilograms did not go toward her. It went straight through the space where she had just been standing, toward the man. The man managed to fire 1 shot. The bullet buried itself in the wooden boards behind Holly, half a handspan from her ear, but he didn't have time to fire a second one. The impact of the horse's 2 front legs slamming down onto his shoulder and chest sounded like a great piece of timber snapping in half. He collapsed onto the stable floor, the gun skidding 3 meters away. Midnight stood over him for 1 more beat, its front hooves stamping into the straw. Then it backed away 2 steps, flicked its tail once, and stood still. Its breathing was heavy, its nostrils flaring, but it didn't charge again. It looked at Holly, and in that moment, she realized the animal had known how to tell the difference between the 2 people in the stable. It had known who she was. She leaned against the wooden wall for a while, not daring to move, because she wasn't sure her legs could still hold her up. Then she heard footsteps running over the gravel near the side door. Her whole body tightened. The side door flew open a second time. Tristan stood in the doorway, one shoulder of his shirt torn, a streak of blood on his face that wasn't his. He took in the scene inside the stable, saw the man lying on the floor, saw Midnight standing 3 steps away, saw Holly leaning against the wall. He lowered his gun. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded once. "Mary is in the dry feed room. She doesn't know anything. She's counting in there." Tristan nodded, turned away, and began doing the things men like him knew to do in such situations. Not rushing, but not moving slowly either. He made 2 short phone calls. Within 3 minutes, 2 of the estate's men entered the stable, silent and quick, and dragged the man outside on a tarp. Tristan crouched down, fitted the key into the lock of the dry feed room, and pulled the door open a crack. He didn't step inside. He only spoke into the room, making his voice as gentle as he could. "Mary, it's me, Uncle Tristan. Are you still counting?" A small voice answered from inside. 42, 43. "Good girl. Keep counting. I'll come back for you in 5 minutes. Daddy's on his way home." He closed the door again and left the latch as it was. Then he turned to Holly, about to take her out of the stable. But at that exact moment, the side door burst open again. Weston stepped inside. He had run from the parking area. His long black coat hung open, the shirt beneath it marked with a streak of dirt at the sleeve, his tie already removed. He stood in the doorway for 1 beat, his eyes sweeping across the stable, taking in every detail in a single second. The black horse standing behind her, the blood on the floor, the bullet buried in the wooden boards, the woman leaning against the wall. There was a small cut on her forehead, and blood had dried in a line down one side of her face. One sleeve of her flannel shirt was torn from shoulder to elbow. Her hand was trembling. He walked past Tristan, past Midnight, straight to her. For the first time since that morning in the training yard many weeks ago, he touched her. He held her, not the embrace of an employer holding an employee. Not a polite embrace. He pulled her into his chest, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand at the back of her neck, lowering his face to the crown of her head. His whole body trembled once, very faintly, a tremor only she could feel because she was inside his arms. She didn't hold him back. She didn't push him away either. Her arms hung at her sides, but she leaned her head against his chest, and she whispered, her voice rough and soft, just loud enough for him to hear. "Mary's safe." She didn't see anything. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the estate looked no different from an ordinary Saturday in upstate New York. The 2 bullets in the wooden boards of the stable had been pried out, the holes filled with sawdust and glue. The blood stain on the gravel of the side path had been washed away with a pressure hose. The yard in front of the outer gate had been cleaned before 4 o'clock. The grass had been raked back into place, and the broken lights had been replaced. Brannon's 2 men had been taken away during the night, along a road with no license plates, together with 3 others whom Tristan and the estate guards had dealt with at the gate. The Hargrove family cleanup team had done this kind of work many times before, quietly and without leaving a trace, and this was one of the reasons the family name was still spoken with unease inside closed rooms in Boston and Atlantic City. When Mary came down to the kitchen for breakfast at 7 o'clock, she had already been returned to her own room sometime after midnight, after Tristan brought her out of the dry feed room and carried her back to bed. She had counted to 197 before the door opened, and she was very proud of that. She sat at the kitchen table eating pancakes with maple syrup, telling Mrs. Otis about the dream she had had, a dream with a black horse and a fox wearing a coat. Weston sat with her for half the meal. He kissed the top of her head twice. The little girl didn't ask why Daddy had a scratch on the back of his left hand. It wasn't worth asking for a 6-year-old child eating pancakes on a clear morning. Holly didn't come down for breakfast. She had gone out to the stable at 6 o'clock. The cut on her forehead already covered with a small medical strip Tristan had placed there during the night. She sat on a low wooden chair in front of Midnight's stall, and the black horse stood with its neck resting against the wooden rail, its head lowered near her. Neither of them needed to say anything. Weston found her there at 8:15. He had showered, changed into a gray shirt, and left the collar unbuttoned. He brought 2 cups of hot coffee. He handed one to her, set the other on the edge of the chair beside her, then sat down on that chair. Not too close, not too far. For a while, they only drank coffee and looked at Midnight. "My wife's name was Clara," he finally said. His voice was steady, but it no longer carried the layer of defense it had carried that night in the reading room. "She was an architect. We got married when she was 27. We had Mary a year later. She knew what I did. She knew before we got married. She thought she could live with it. She did live with it, for 4 years." He took a sip of coffee. He looked down into the cup. "That afternoon I had 2 appointments overlapping. One in Tribeca with a partner, one in Queens to inspect a warehouse. I called her and told her I needed her to check the warehouse for me. Just pass through and sign a paper. I shouldn't have used that car. I should have known that any car of mine parked at that warehouse over the past month had been marked. I did know. I just didn't think about it for 40 minutes. 40 minutes was enough." She didn't look at him. She looked at Midnight. "For the past 3 years, I thought the only way not to lose anyone else was to let no one come close. I believed that. I lived by that. Until you walked into my training yard." He paused. The coffee in her hand had gone cold. "I've started doing something I didn't think I would do 3 years ago. I'm turning Hargrove Capital into something Mary can inherit when she grows up, without inheriting an entire family with it. That will take a few years, maybe 5, maybe 7. Tristan will take over the rest until it's clean. I'm not telling you this to buy you. I'm telling you because it's the truth. You told me there was a question I hadn't asked correctly. I think the right question is the one I'm asking now. Are you willing to stay long enough to see me become the man I'm trying to become?" She didn't answer right away. She set her coffee cup down on the gravel beneath the chair. She reached over and placed her hand on top of his, where it rested on his thigh. Her hand was still trembling a little from the night before, but this time she didn't hide it. She said nothing. She only nodded once, slowly and firmly. He looked at her hand on his for a long while. Then he turned his hand over, and their fingers laced together. Not tightly, not hurriedly. Midnight exhaled one long breath through its nose, and the 3 of them, the man, the woman, and the black horse, sat still there in the early sunlight beginning to slip through the gaps between the wooden boards of the stable. 6 months later, the Hargrove estate entered a spring that none of those who had lived through that November night had thought they would ever see. Brannon Whitfield was arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a Tuesday morning at his hotel in Atlantic City, holding a cup of coffee and a financial newspaper in his hands. The evidence reached federal agents through an independent attorney in Washington, one with no paper trail tying him to any family, and he submitted a file nearly 400 pages thick, including transactions, recordings, and Brannon's travel schedule over the past 3 years. The Hargrove name appeared nowhere in the file, but in Boston and Manhattan, those who knew how to read the silences of that world understood that something had changed in the way the Hargrove family operated. Hargrove Capital began the transformation Weston had told Holly about that morning in the stable. Tristan took over the old part, running it with a clear path toward gradual closure, no expansion, no new business, only holding it steady until every thread could be untangled cleanly, without leaving anyone harmed. Weston focused on the public side, investing in agricultural technology and healthcare, work he never thought he would be doing 5 years earlier. Holly was no longer a nanny. In early March, she signed a contract to run a new program at the estate, an equine therapy program for orphaned children from care centers in New York and New Jersey. The program was funded by Weston, but his name appeared in none of the public materials. The name carved onto the wooden sign hanging at the gate of the new stable was her father's name, Bennett Horse Program. She had chosen that name alone one evening while sitting on the porch. Midnight became the horse every child who came to the program wanted to meet first, though it was only allowed to stand in its stall and look out, not participate directly. To Mary, it was a friend. The little girl came to the stable every afternoon after school, carrying a carrot, standing by the wooden rail and telling it about everything she had done that day. The black horse listened as if every word from her mattered. One April afternoon, the weather had warmed enough to take off sweaters. Mary ran from the classroom into the backyard, holding a drawing folded into quarters, calling for Daddy and Miss Holly as she ran. They were standing by the fence of the small yard, where a new foal had been brought in to grow familiar with the space. The little girl handed the paper to Weston first, then immediately corrected herself and handed it to both of them. Weston unfolded it. The picture showed 4 figures standing side by side: a man with dark blonde hair, a woman with brown hair tied back, a little girl in the middle, and a black horse standing behind all 3 of them. Above the drawing, in the round, crooked handwriting of a 6-year-old child who had only been in school for 6 months, she had written, "My family." Weston looked at the picture for a very long time. Then he folded it and slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt, close to his heart. He looked at Holly. Mary had already run toward the foal, not knowing she had just rearranged the world of the 2 adults beside her with a single sheet of paper. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice quiet. It wasn't the question he had asked on the stable gravel 6 months before. This one was different. This one asked about the rest of a lifetime. Holly looked toward Mary, then toward the black horse resting its head against the wooden rail as it watched them, then toward the late afternoon sunlight spreading across the gravel yard. "I didn't come here to fit in," she answered. "I came here to belong." He reached out his hand. She took it. Dust still hung in the air at the end of the day, the dust of gravel and straw and evening light. But this time, it was no longer a warning no one had been able to read. It was only the dust of an ordinary afternoon, on an estate where a man, a woman, a child, and a black horse had learned how to stand beside one another. There are stories that teach us people aren't measured by what they own, or by the pain they carry, but by whether they're brave enough to see another human being exactly as they are, and still choose to stay. There are wounds that time doesn't heal, but that can be healed by someone willing to listen instead of conquer. There are families that aren't born from blood, but built from moments like a warm glass of milk, a paper crane, a folk song, and one hand placed over another in the early sunlight. If this story has touched something inside you, if you believe the quietest people in the room are often the ones carrying the deepest stories, please hit the like button so this story can reach more people who may need it. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear a warm story at this very moment, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you'll have a story that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. How do you feel about Holly, about Weston, about the black horse named Midnight, and about the 6-year-old child who folded a paper crane at the exact moment a woman needed it most? Did you recognize yourself anywhere in this story? In Holly during those early years when she carried too much alone? In Weston during the years when he believed the only way not to lose more was to let no one come close? Or in someone else in your life whom this story reminded you of? Leave a comment below and tell us, because every comment you write is another story that we and other viewers would love to listen to. May you and the people you love have truly good health, a joyful life every day, and many peaceful afternoons like the final afternoon of this story. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.